All right. Quick introduction. I worked at Technicolor for a long period of time in different roles, both on the IT side, was a CIO at one point, and then spent a lot of time on home entertainment and then broadcast and media distribution. So, and then some time in startups on the other side of the chain, and now work with Sohonet. So, just to better understand my audience, I thought I'd try to get you guys to raise your hand in one of two categories. Those of you in the room who are actually in post-production or post-production services, can I get your... All right. And those of you who are selling technology or services to post-production companies, everybody else. All right. Okay, I'm gonna. I built this pitch to be for post-production services. So we'll talk about a little bit about post-production, how it works today. I think it dovetails well with what Christine just showed you, and I think Shane earlier from Equinix. But I'm going to talk about what exists today and what the problems are that drive security challenges. When I think about this topic, I'm sure you guys all have the same. Maybe Eric is the most relevant knowledge here, but I get lots of cocktail questions, whether that's at CES or NAB or whatever, where they go, "Wow, huge hacking experience in the post-production world. Why? How's that happen?" Right? I mean, there's firewalls, there's encryption. How's it happen? And I have some views on how that happens, and we'll cover that and some ideas on just sort of, let's call them workflow techniques where you can help solve that problem. So, okay. How many people worked in a startup before? Most of the room. Okay. All right. So when you think on the left-hand side of the slide up here, you know, I'd say probably everybody, even if you haven't worked in one before, knows the story, right? You have a great idea, somebody brings some capital, and then you're in a race, right? Because your great idea, unless you patented the crap out of it, isn't going to last forever. You have lots of competitors, and essentially all the valuation is driven by how fast you can get big, right, before someone else buys you, okay? So no surprise, the concept of virtual, not using CapEx, is a well-understood world, right? And we've had a lot of great SaaS tools that have come out of this, right? Anyone use Expensify? By far my favorite app in the world, right? Not that I hate expenses, but I mean, it takes me literally 8 or 10 minutes a month now to do my expenses, where it used to take hours. So it's a great example of you don't need to go buy an expensive tool. You have a really simple app that is near free to use and is really simple, right? On the right-hand side, same concept. I think the challenge is that most, let's call it, say, media industry outsiders that don't understand about our industry is they think of a studio, Fox, Lionsgate, Disney, and they think of these organizations that have been around for hundreds of years or 50 years. And they think of these multi-billion-dollar corporations. But the way money flows for production isn't from studios. Money flows just like on the left-hand side. Somebody comes together with an idea, and they have money, and they want to put it together, right? And they have the same challenge as a startup has. How do I pull this thing together? Meeting my budget, spending most of my money, quite honestly, on talent and visual effects. Okay, go look at any of your big blockbuster recipes. Half your $200 million production budget goes to talent. The other half goes to all the visual effects companies. Okay, but how do I do all that in a manner where I can have the same effect of a startup? Then, in a very short period of time, I shoot. I take all that data somewhere else. All the actors have cleared out, and then I do my magic part: editing, post-production, color grading, sound, mixing, all this kind of stuff. The one big difference between these two is the guy on the right literally disappears. The legal entity disappears for lots of reasons in Hollywood. Avatar, largest movie in history, right? Biggest grossing movie in history. And the investors who invested on net profits got paid zero because it didn't make a net profit, right? These productions are highly financially engineered based on who's investing in them. Usually the distribution studio takes a big cut of distribution, a big fee, and that most productions end up financially making exactly zero. So they do disappear as an entity. Literally, the follow-on movies made with a different production entity, not the same one, right? For lots of financial reasons. So the difference is the guys on the left get to sell this thing to somebody, and it's their problem to deal with sunk capex. The guys on the right, it's their problem because they literally are going to take the company to a zero balance. Okay? So, and I'm sorry we don't have some cool virtual mouse. All right, so how's it work? I think most of the people in the room who are close to this understand. Things come together, right? Shoot ends. Everyone gets in a room, and most of the talent's gone, and you have the director, the cinematographer, maybe studio, the ultimate rights owners, distribution executives are going to be involved somewhere between 6 and 9 months. I mean, a romantic comedy might be 3 months, depends on their budget, right? And you're going to have a number of people involved in that process, right? As Christine described, there's a collaboration process, right? They're going to go out to typically 15 collaboration partners, right? So these 10 to 15 collaboration partners, how do they get picked? Well, sometimes it's the old boy network, right? Sometimes it's that they've been working together for years. They know somebody. They trust somebody. Trust is an important thing when you come together for a short period. Sometimes they literally do an auction. We were part of the Hobbit process. They're a customer of ours. They literally chose 15 collaboration partners on a Friday at the result of their, I wouldn't call it an auction process, but a result of their sourcing process. And on Monday, all 15 collaboration partners had to be live, most of them receiving more than 500 terabytes of data over the weekend, right? So it's a massive problem, right? So anyway, to exacerbate that problem, on this last piece, you have, the actors go away rather quickly. Your directors, cinematographers, and your movie executives don't have the luxury of working on one project at a time, right? So while they're in the editing mode of one movie, they might be shooting another movie, or they might be editing multiple movies at once, typically in different continents, right? All these tax credits has created a massive travel problem for this end of the talent spectrum, right? So you have a director or a cinematographer who's required to be in London for a couple weeks, and then he's got to come out to LA to do some of that, or maybe he goes to New York, or maybe he pops back down to New Zealand. It's a huge, huge challenge for them because virtual isn't virtual yet, right? And again, I'm sure everyone in this room understands big data, but these are big problems, right? Massive amounts of data being created and moved. The 25 terabyte side would be like a romantic comedy. The 1 petabyte side would be massive, Avengers 2, The Hobbit 3, those kind of scale productions, right? Where they're doing 4K, sometimes higher than 4K workflows for VFX shots. They're doing left eye, right eye, multiple aspect ratios, tons and tons of data. And remember, in the old days, you had the cutting room floor. That doesn't exist anymore, right? They save everything, right? Who knows if they're going to need it? So again, this whole concept of you have less than 6 months, so you have a massive amount, or not a whole lot of time to move a massive amount of data, and then this concept that the data just keeps growing, right? And I would suggest in the short term being the next 5 years, data is going to outstrip the growth of the internet, meaning that everyone knows how fast the internet grows. This data in the industry right now is growing faster. It will stop. We'll hit 8K workflows at some point, and there'll be no reason, in theory, to go beyond that, right? Maybe in VFX you could see going a little bit further as you create something that's way in the background of something that you want to eventually be able to bring to the foreground. But eventually the data growth stops because the human eye can only see so much, right? Unless movie screens start to become really, really, really big. But at least not in scale. Okay, so what happens? Right? Someday I think we'll have the virtual world that we'd all like to see where you can sort of automatically provision networking, automatically provision more than networking, service providers, right? Automatically provision, and you can get some of this today from cloud. You can maybe transcode something in real time and get it back. But you can't really send something out and get it sound mixed in real time, right? There's creative talent involved. So there's a ton of challenges here, right? You have this how do I access these multiple partners? And these partners are creative partners, right? Doing different parts of the chain, but all at once. So if you think about, a big movie that you've seen recently, the entire movie typically goes to multiple providers. So take VFX, for example. No one visual effects provider can do the whole movie. They're just not big enough. There isn't a single provider in the world who's big enough. Typically, they have between 3 and 5 VFX partners, and they have sort of an anchor partner who helps manage the whole thing. But they're often sending the entire movie to everybody, because if you're working on a character like Gollum, he might be in every scene or lots of scenes. So you can't just take, the first 20 minutes of the movie. So you're getting a lot of data that's pushed around to a lot of partners, right? What's more important, cost or delivery assurance? I can promise you, if they're spending $200 million on a movie, what they really give a shit about is, does it get there when they want it to get there? They care a lot less about that it costs $5 or $4. Okay, delivery assurance, I would say, is the most important thing, and that doesn't matter if it's data moving. That same thing for the guy who has to deliver the sound mix. He's got to make his deadline, or the whole production gets pushed back. And I can tell you one thing that does not move in this industry is the release date. That does not change. They communicate release dates weeks, months, years sometimes out in advance, and they're trying to parlay that release date off other competitors. Well, hey, if Superman's going live on that weekend, we can't go live on that weekend. We got to pick a different weekend, right? So they're not going to move the release date because somebody in a chain's late, right? Which results in what? Lots of nights and weekends. I can tell you from my experience, from all the years I've been working in this ridiculous industry, everything breaks on Friday night or Saturday. It never breaks during a weekday. I don't know why. Seems unfair. As I was describing earlier, you end up either parking or landing these big video projects. So landing is lots of collaborators need to work all together at once. All that data's got to go somewhere temporarily so they can all feed off it, right? And parking is, I'm on a TV production shot. I'm in my editing suite. I finish maybe Friday night, maybe I finish Sunday night, and the suite's already been sold to the next crew. I don't have time to go through that massive amount of data to figure out what to keep and what to jettison. So I need to put it somewhere so I can come back a few weeks from now and then look at it, right? So I need to park it somewhere, a temporary sort of process. We talked about these executives. It's not a whole lot of them, but this requirement to have collaboration remotely with the poor director who's in one, maybe he's in London and maybe the cinematographer's in New York, and maybe the studio executive's here in LA. You do have this weird challenge of these people have to work together. Oftentimes today, the answer is get on a flight and go somewhere for 3 weeks. But we're right at the cusp. The technology's there, the networking capability's there. It's really making this stuff work in real time. That's the hard part. Cloud, as everyone knows, is a big deal. More and more production processes are moving into cloud environments. The challenge, as everyone rightly pointed out earlier, is the cloud sounds great because you can do something by the drink, and then some big telco says, yep, but sign us a contract for 3 years. And you're like, well, hang on a second. My production is only going to last 6 months. And how is that bursting into a cloud if I got to pay for 3 years? DR, no surprise, is all about cost. It's DR after all, right? We're not trying to make permanent copies. We're trying to make something in case there's a fire. Almost every production in the world has an insurance requirement. In what used to be the dailies that went off to get made in a film lab somewhere overnight, they would keep a copy somewhere, so it's off production. These days, it's most likely the case that they're creating LTO, and before everyone can go home for the day, they make one copy of the LTO, and they have to send it somewhere, right? Typically, a production studio into a safe, right? In case there's a fire that night, the insurance company doesn't want to lose all the shots they had. And then security, right? And I realize this talks about security, and Eric's going to love this comment. Unfortunately, this is the last thing they think about. Okay? And so what happens? Hopefully they're in a specialized place, right? They go to, I think it was on one of Christine's slides earlier, they're in a Pinewood. Here in town, they'd be in a Lantana or a Tribeca. They're in a specialized either shooting and editing place or just a post-production place, right? It could be on Universal's lot. It could be on Fox's lot. It could be one of these specialized companies that does this for a living. They're going to have access to what I would describe as sort of modern post-production technology services, right? But typically, they're shooting in locations or their post-production processing in locations that are chosen for tax credits, not necessarily for connectivity, right? You got to remember that despite the fact that we would love our services to be the center of the universe, they're not, right? So typically what happens is they scramble, right? They didn't choose a location to fit what we believe is a sort of virtual workflow. They choose it for a bunch of other reasons, either because, quite frankly, the director lives on that side of town, right? Or because they like going there. They like going to that location, right? They like the offices there. The majority of the production people might be on that side of town. They might be in Santa Monica, or they might be in New York for that matter, right? What you end up having is a group of 20 to 30 people who are sometimes very talented in technology and sometimes the opposite end of that scale, pulling together a bunch of equipment, right? Trying to figure out how to do this production process with what I would describe, and I have an editing process here, hodgepodge of equipment and software, all right? It is never the same twice. Even the same production that goes to make movie number 2 or number 3, it's not the same thing. And when they run out of technology, they can't, use a spare license to shoot a massive amount of data from one location to another. They put it on a hard drive, and they hand it to a kid on a bike and say, take it across town, right? Again, dates don't change, okay? Typically what happens in this process is time moves on, the amount of stuff that they have to do gets backed up, executives get frustrated, work efficiency, I would argue that word doesn't exist after a while, right? So about the 5th month, efficiency's gone out the window. And I think the thing that suffers most is this last one, right? At the end of the day, you start making decisions. Are we going to hit our date? The first question comes, cost. Once you've gotten over the sort of the gastrointestinal problem of blowing your budget, then it just becomes, can I get it done? They don't stop to go, you know what? Putting these things on hard drives is probably less secure than I want it to be. Or opening up to more collaboration partners is going to expose us more. Have we reviewed the firewall rules? That's not part of the process. They're driving as fast as they can. Again, there's probably 2 sets of best practices, and I think Christine and Shane outlined somewhere where we'd like to see the industry head for sure. But in today's world, you have a choice. You either go to a studio or a production company that has access to what I described in here as modern post-production technology. You go to Pinewood, that exists. You go to Lantana here in town, that exists. You go to Universal, Fox, Disney, you're on their lot doing post-production, and they have access to either these services or they have access to a rather large network where you're going to be able to, with some effort, get access to those services, right? Some are better than others in terms of your ability to access multiple third parties to do everything. So what are these? By the way, a lot of companies don't do either one of these. Just to be, as much as it makes sense that until the virtual world exists and you can buy things by the drink everywhere, you should do one of these 2 things. It is very often the case that for tax credits, they choose a warehouse in Vancouver. I'm not kidding you, a warehouse in Vancouver or a warehouse in Atlanta, Georgia, wherever the tax credit is, right? Or they choose that office space that's really close to the director's house, and no one's thought through all these challenges it's going to create, right? So again, and I would say we see that at least 50% of the time, all right? So let's pretend you could have access to these. What are these sort of modern post-production services? One, sort of generically, you need to be able to connect in, right? You need to be able to get in to that data to let's say, consume those services, right? You kind of have a description or a choice in the beginning. You either go after an internet-only approach, Aspera can get you there in tool set, but you're immediately dealing with a high-contention traffic network. And the challenge that you're going to have with bullet number 1, if you go the internet route, is your delivery assurance drops. All right. So imagine that you're in the middle of post-production. You're in the middle of the most important part of sharing data on a Thursday night, and House of Cards, heaven forbid, goes live that night. You cannot control what happens to the internet, even at the biggest peering points. Right. Even at the AIX that happens in, in Virginia or in El Segundo or up in the Bay Area, right? You're going to have massive congestion. You can't stop that. So maybe it delays your specific piece of the process by 3 hours. 3 hours might be the end of the world for you, right? The second piece is security. I describe security a number of ways, right? You have classic hard passwords for the people who are going to open whatever this super double secret content is that hasn't been on the street yet, right? You're going to have encryption in transit, encryption at rest, right? You're going to have firewalls to create layers of protection from people who are trying to get to your bad super double secret content. But it's a challenge. Again, think about the people who are putting this together in the short period of time they're putting it together. They're not security experts, okay? They are, at the end of the day, going to do what's expedient, not what's secure, right? File transfer services, no surprise. There's a bunch of great companies out there that do that, like Aspera, like Signet, like File Catalyst, et cetera. Digital storage services, I would say the cloud stuff is new. I don't know many productions who are building stuff in public clouds yet. The Sony problem didn't help the industry with that regard. There are a lot of what I would call private or hybrid cloud options that exist for people. A lot of people are still backing up on, devices that they can physically move. So it's a challenge. It's definitely an area of an opportunity. And then real-time remote collaboration. Again, this ability to solve the ability for a director and a cinematographer and the executive to get together are still challenged areas, but something that certainly is required. So my summary is, if you can solve these 5 things, right? It doesn't matter what set of vendors you use, but if you can solve these 5 things, you'll actually have a pretty seamless production workflow. You just have to think this through before the production editing process starts. I don't think you have to figure it out before the shooting starts, but before the editing starts. Okay? And I think that's it for me. Questions? Well, we got to wait for the... They want to make sure they can capture your voice.
Yeah. In there, you talk about going to specialized locations, which, I mean, you know as well as anybody that those decisions aren't made based on, the production company decisions are rarely, if ever, made based on network locations. Or security. So in there, do you see there's the responsibility of the locations to provide network security and infrastructure, or do you see it as network security should be deployed to those locations?
Let me bifurcate the answer. One is, let's pretend we're shooting on a big stage. It could be in a big lot, but a big stage. So take, I don't know, the next Star Wars or something like that, right? They're going to pick most of these really big production movies, multi-$100-million movies. Even for the parts that they shoot on location, the majority of the work's going to be done in a big Pinewood location, something like that, right? And in that case, if Pinewood were in the room right now, they would raise their hand and say, that's our job. We need to provide, just as like we have to provide lighting, grip, lumber, whatever else, we want to provide all that stuff too to make sure our customers can have that. That obviously falls down when they're doing extensive on-location shooting. And at that point, there's not an easy answer, right? Even if you had, in this country, the concept of sort of bonding multiple LTE channels from different providers, most of the places that you're shooting on location don't have that at all. Forget multiple partners, any partner, right? Bandwidth, satellite bandwidth is hard and expensive. And so most of the, at least current process is they shoot everything, they load it up on hard drives, right? So they might have local Wi-Fi for the production that they're doing, but it's not going anywhere. And then they try to get those hard drives to someplace. We have plenty of customers who, especially if they're in far reaches of the world, they'll do the math and they'll go, how much data, what's it cost to send the data from point A to point B, and what's it cost for a plane ticket, right? And we still see some productions out of New Zealand who will take the plane ticket option. It's cheaper. So,
how do you extend that security? So, in the software-defined networking world, as long as you're on the network, these things can all be deployed instantaneously, everything else, until the production moves 5 feet from that connection.
Yeah, I think once they're on a connection, those services, there's lots of companies who can provide that. As long as, again, if you wait till the day you start the editing process, I think you're screwed. But if you plan ahead, there's lots of companies who can provide those services. if you're doing the on location stuff, physical security is your biggest friend. Imagine that these hard drives are just film canisters and treat them that way until you get them ingested into a server, and protect them, right? Encryption at rest, two-factor authentication. I mean, if you're the biggest risk to any of this stuff is pre-production content, meaning content that has not seen street, right? Even though Marvel might argue that their trailers were obviously very valuable as well, since they had their own incident there. So, other questions? All right. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Chuck.